just on the previous submission for texture sheets, please note that there's quite a few assignments still outstanding. It amounts to 20% of your marks, so, and it's a byproduct of the process that you need to go through in any case. So even though it's late, it's still worth handing it in and having it in place. And even if you get penalized, like to 50%, it's still 10% more than what you have at the moment. I mean, having a 20% deficit is quite a lot. It means that you have to already get 70% just to pass. So please hand in your texture sheets. Make sure that all the assignments are checked. And again, even if they're late, better than never. So yeah, just upload those. And if you have any questions surrounding any of these assignments or regarding any of the assignments, you're welcome to just comment on them, and or send me a mail, and then I'll, if there's any sort of confusion regarding the deliverables, I'll clarify it in the comments and just sort of, make sure everyone knows what's expected and how to produce that. So this last and final assignment for the module is called Interactive Asset Showcase, and remember, you can either use Sketchfab or Unity. And in Unity, we're going to provide you with an asset showcase sort of template. Now, I've linked it here, but we're also still in the process. So this one is from last year, and in the other class, I went through some of the issues, and it's still producing quite a few errors. I think it's just script references and things like that I need to sort out. But it's now converted to Universal Render Pipeline, and you'll be able to drop your assets in here, and we're going to look at what the sort of post-processing stack does. I know that you've done that in your major, in game major. Paulo probably went through post-processing with you in any case, because your games are, would require post-processing. But we'll also just compare what that looks like and the type of post-processing that you get versus the type of post-processing that you'll encounter when you work with Sketchfab, and what these look like. So we'll get there. Yeah, so this link I'll update, but at least you know what's expected. And when the deadline is. So we do have, luckily we have another session before this final hand-in. There's not a lot of content that we really need to cover still, other than, I think, lighting, render pipelines, and post-processing. So I think some of the tutorials that I shared with you do cover these, and or to some extent at least. Now I'm going to continue expanding on that, but there's no class content for week 8, so we can use that slot for any sort of last minute assistance that you may need. Also for this class, if you I think we are going to have some extra time. If you are still struggling with any of the parts of the process, then you can upload your work to this shared folder, which I'll just share the link to again in the comments. So you're welcome to drop your models in there. I'm doing okay, thank you very much. All right. So some of the things that I've covered in that little set of tutorials are also covered in these larger seminars that Unity did, but kind of more directly related to our workflows. So they're much shorter, and in some cases there's also things, that often change, like within a matter of months. So since we started this term, there's already a couple of things that is kind of changed, and it will continue to change. So I'm not a big fan of doing like highly technical tutorials, because you're always going to need to reference the latest sort of manuals and APIs, and figure out, how does this process actually work now. What's more important to me is that you understand the underlying methodology. So whether or not the tools change, the methods sort of stay the same, and the thinking stays the same, and has stayed the same for the past, since PBR rendering became a thing, I think about 5 years ago. And before that, we were all just sort of doing everything our own way, and we had sort of standard shaders, and every application would use their own material setup, and everything needs to be converted into something else. Now, even the other day, I looked into, because I spotted it here when I was doing the universal render pipeline setup. When you import your models into, let's see, where's a model that I can just grab and pop in here? Even this one. The moment that you import your models, you're faced with this question whether or not you want to extract the materials and the textures, and if you've done a good job at prepping your model for Unity, you wouldn't have too many of these. You'd only have one material, or maybe a material per object, and then some textures. And most likely, if you're coming from something like Substance or Blender or whatever, those textures won't be embedded in the FBX, so you'd need to import those textures separately in any case. But there is a new import via material description, which is currently experimental, but it's worth noting that Unity and other software applications are working towards making this process a lot easier for us. So if you look at what this material description experimental actually entails, you'll see that it brings in material properties that are in line with other software applications, right? So or from other software applications. So it supports FBX standard materials, Arnold standard materials, SketchUp, Collada, etc. So Blender is not currently on the list, but basically what this means is that when you've set up your material and it has certain properties like opacity or specularity or anything in the material itself, it will bring that with it. And I think, things are always becoming more accessible and easier for people to use, without them sacrificing on functionality, but just sort of making things easier for the end user, and that's great. But at the same time, like I said, it's constantly changing, and you always have to kind of refer to the manuals and make sure that you stay up to date with the latest. So that was part of the process, and the problem that we were experiencing with this project is that it was done in a previous version. So we had lightweight render pipeline in here, and we had to figure out a way to do ambient occlusion in the scene, because even now with universal render pipeline, Unity still doesn't, or URP still doesn't support deferred rendering, so it can't do ambient occlusion off the bat. So you have to find workarounds and things like that, even though in your post-processing stack you have ambient occlusion as an option. Well, it appears not. I think they may have actually removed it. Yeah, so certain times you have to add those things, so that might explain why I think this most recent tutorial that I did on the post-processing actually includes the installation of HDRP, which is a not HDRP, sorry, a Horizon-based ambient occlusion, HBAO, which is a paid-for asset that we'll include in the asset showcase project that we're sharing with you. So things like ambient occlusion and what other processing did we use? Stuff like bloom and whatever you add to this to make it look prettier. You can go and tweak afterwards, but those things will all be included and set up for you. Again, I'm not too concerned with you going through the ropes and actually installing those, but I do want you to understand how those things work and how they tie in together with the final display. A lot of the post-processing stuff that you'll find in both Unity and Sketchfab are actually sort of legacy effects that we found in cinema. So things like grain and chromatic aberration and vignetting and things like those are often or were historically things that would happen as a side effect of working with film or with physical lenses and physical cameras. And what people like ILM, Industrial Lights and Magic, have been doing for years is writing shaders that mimic real world scenarios, right? So that it looks realistic. Industrial Lights and Magic. I believe Industrial Lights and Magic was first. It was George Lucas's company. Originated with sort of the the need for CG in films. And if you go and research where, if you sort of look at the history of Industrial Lights and Magic, they used to, I think they've changed their website since then. I'm going to try and just do an ILM Tech timeline. See if I can find something on that. Might be that one. But a lot of the technologies that we find in our 3D workflow today, no, these are just people working on it. You'll see that like stuff like subsurface scattering, ambient occlusion, bloom, those were all things found Lucasfilm, Indiana Jones. That's the actual, it's not the tech timeline. I'll find it and I'll share it with you guys. But it's really interesting to see what a hand Industrial Lights and Magic played in that arena, and that's kind of like what we all use now. I think nowadays Pixar is also bringing out a lot of tools that sort of become industry standard. And we get to use those in our software applications. So that's a lot of fun, and very exciting that you get I think the turnover time for those technologies are also speeding up quite a bit. So we're all like right on the cusp of, having industry standard tools accessible to us, and being able to create those sort of things at the same level. So with that said, we can have a quick look at sorry, that wasn't really necessary. I can get rid of this again. Have a quick look at this post-processing stack. Okay, so by default, this is a new project that I created just using the universal render pipeline. If you do that, then the post-processing stack and the render pipeline is already in place. So this is pretty much what the scene looks like, and you can simply go and find the post-processing volume, which in this case is just an empty game object with the volume component on it. If you set it to global, it affects everything in the project or in the current scene, and you can add things like tone mapping, color grading, bloom effects, vignetting. So vignetting traditionally would be, and bloom as well, would be sort of an exposure type of thing that would happen if if the camera sees something that's particularly bright, then it would sort of blur and give us a glow effect. With each one of these elements that you add, I think the only thing you need to keep in mind is that if you add an override, it's not necessarily on by default. So like it's on, but it's not doing anything, and that's for optimizational purposes. So you want to make sure that you only use the values that you absolutely require. Like intensity would definitely be one of those. Let's see, grain would definitely need that as well. But starting to see it a little bit here, but it can get a bit rough, and that's, I think, the case with most of these post-processing tools. They're kind of like Photoshop filters. Like you want to use them because they do add a level of polish and professionalism to your work. It just makes everything look better, especially things like tweaking the highlights and shadows in your scenes, because a common pitfall for the hobbyists and sort of amateur artists is that they either under or overlight their scenes, and this just sort of being able to tweak your shadows and bring that forward, and maybe dumb down some of the harshest of the highlights already does a lot to your scene. But the moment that you push these values too high, you start getting like really strange results. So everything sort of with a pinch of salt, everything in moderation. Same goes for the depth of field, the bloom. You want to do it as subtle as possible. But yeah, let's quickly have a look at what it looks like in Sketchfab, because I think quite a number of you are going to try this. Now, maybe just jump back one step into lighting. What we've done with this scene is we've done a directional light, which is our key light, and then there's another spotlight coming from this angle, which is our full light, and then there's a general sort of ambience, but there's only really two lights I believe the ambience is coming from the actual skybox. Let me just see if it's, yeah, so it's generated some lighting based on the skybox. And this is a sort of a very typical setup for lighting an object in studio. And this is actually, as far as I can tell, this looks like the grotto. I think it might be the grotto. Yeah? No, or the film studio, but I saw it. That's an open window chair. So it's getting a little bit of light information from the HDRI that's in there, and again, these things are sort of universally applied, even though they don't necessarily function on a technical level in the same way. They'll still be present in the other applications. So here in Sketchfab, you have the added benefit of loading some light presets. So you can decide on what sort of lighting setup you want, like whether it's low key lighting, right? The one thing that I did notice about this particular object, though, or model that I've imported, is I think it's facing the wrong direction. So a lot of the times when I add the lighting presets, it just seems like it's the opposite of what I want. So this is a typical 3-point lighting system that has a key light and a fill light and a rim light to make the object stand out, but as you can see, it's lighting up more of the back of the character than anything else. So I should change that and flip that around. Now you can grab any of these lights and then you should be able to move them. Just see, yeah, so if you select the light, you can move them around. Directional lights, though, they're only, because they're only directional, they're parallel light rays. It doesn't really matter where they are, so all of these just need to be rotated. Sorry, my computer's chugging a little bit. I'm just going to quit a bunch of things. Okay. Hopefully that's a little lighter and I don't crash. But yeah, I was just struggling to navigate that scene a bit. Yeah, it feels a little bit more responsive now. Okay, so you can grab any of these lights and you can go and rotate them. So let's see, directional. That would be the key light, right? So we actually want that light to shine from the front. I don't think that you're you're probably not going to have models that are facing the wrong direction. I think this is quite an old model. Come on, please rotate. Alright, so my key light is my main light angle. Fill light is normally sort of from a bounce angle, so it's not the same direction as your key light. It's normally in a complementary angle, or even from the bottom up. And then your rim light, oh, that's my fill light down there. This was actually my rim light. So the rim light's meant to shine from the back, and then the fill light, let's see that one. That's more from like to simulate a kind of a bounce of light from the the ground on up. So whatever light, wherever the light hit objects, objects bounce light onto others, right? So the lighter the object, less light it absorbs, the more light it reflects. So you can, based on what environment this object is in, you can change this full light to match that. Something that they added fairly recently is the actual shadows. So you can pick one of these lights, and normally it would be, I mean, you wouldn't want your fill or your rim light to cast shadows, otherwise it's going to look like he's on the sports field or something, lit by sort of multiple spotlights. You just want shadows on for your main light. Okay. Then let's just zoom in here and see what else we have in terms of lighting, or what else we need to change in terms of lighting. So there's also these annotations that I'll get to later on, but what's nice about, and I'll show you how we set them up, but what's nice about Sketchfab and setting up annotations, and this is one of last, I think 2 years ago's student work, where they set up annotations for their models, is that you can sort of direct the viewer to specific areas of interest. So instead of them just sort of blindly fumbling around, you can say, okay, you know, there's that part, and you know, have a look at this, and then maybe this is a good composition to have. So you can kind of point out areas where you add a detail that you want me to look at. You can do this with, I think, yeah, here's another example of student work where he added annotations, but he didn't add the actual markers on screen. So you can still go through the annotations, and it'll show you like areas of interest. And yeah, it directs the viewer quite nicely. Where it's also very useful is in, I don't know if you've poked around on Sketchfab a bit, but there's some lovely environments that you can also view in VR. And because there's no sort of navigational tools for the VR tools in Sketchfab, you can use annotations to drive the viewer from one point to the next. So you can actually navigate them through an environment if you wanted to. So yeah, Sketchfab's, it's really cool, and you know, there's got some, it has some sort of more commercial applications, like you can obviously embed these into any website, so it serves as a good portfolio space, but you can also purchase a private license, like let's say you got some client work and they want to, maybe they're product designers or they're architectural company that want to visualize some of their stuff and they want to have it web-based, then you know, you can either do it in something like Sketchfab and buy a professional account for them on their behalf, so you can keep their products private, or you can, you know, build it in Unity and publish to web or whatever. Okay, some other, okay, so that's shadow catching. Then you can also pick various HDRIs. I'll include 1 or 2 HDRIs or cube maps in Unity for this template as well, so that you can go and change up the environment lighting, if you will, or if you want to. So there's, I'm going to do this tiny studio one, and then maybe some exterior ones, so you can swap them out. And like I said, you can go and tweak the post-processing, you know, decide on, well, this one's still broken, but decide on what you want to have on, and what helps your scene and what looks best with the models that you have in there. Okay, sorry, jumping between the two applications, just to show you that, you know, they're functioning differently, inherently, because of the tool and the nature of the tool, but in principle they're doing exactly the same thing. So yeah, here in post-processing we also have screen space reflections. Now I don't know how reflective these surfaces are. It made some difference, I think, but it definitely causes more lag. Okay, so it's struggling with the more post-processing you do, and also, yeah, this is quite a heavy model though. I wouldn't strictly call this a game ready model. This is more like an animation model that sort of happened to make its way to to Sketchfab. It's not entirely optimized for this. Okay. Ambient occlusion is for me one of the most essential post-processing processes, because it adds so much depth to models. Like, it just adds a level of detail that's absolutely essential for me, because one of the benefits of modeling things in a 3D space instead of drawing it is that you get shadows for free, right? So shadows are being, well, not free entirely, but I mean, shadows are being calculated by the renderer. So the moment that you switch off shadows or have no shadows and no self-shadowing, then things just start looking really flat and unrealistic. So what ambient occlusion does is it just kind of places those objects in relation to each other. So what would happen in real life is light would shine from any, you know, given angle, and where two objects are really close to each other, the light wouldn't be able to access and bounce or be distributed within that area as much as on other sort of more exposed surfaces. So the ambience is being occluded, and it causes sort of these darker artifacts on objects or shadows where objects are very close to each other, which happens in real life as well. If you look at the corners of your room, or sort of you know, under your desk or something like that, the light is way less there because it can't access there, not just because of shadows but also because of the lack of ambience. So switching that on, immediately you can see that everything just sort of starts fitting together, and they just belong together way better. Other things that I switched on here, I thought that the renderer in general is quite soft, so sharpness helps a bit. But again, these are things that you may want to experiment with and you know, see whether or not it's actually making your object more presentable and look better, rather than you know, adding things that you don't want, or adding artifacts or things like that. If it doesn't work with your model, then simply don't use it. You can be selective about it, but like I said, I think ambient occlusion is quite essential. Vignettes are also nice to have. Again, something that came from a more filmic background. What would traditionally happen with cameras that have lenses is that the light wouldn't be able to enter into the sides of the lens because of the little rim around it, and then you'd find this sort of darkening. And I think what also happened is when you the aperture would also cause it to sort of soften the edges. So vignetting, just for me, it always frames the model a lot better, and it just sort of focuses your attention on what's in the center of the frame. Bloom is just an exposure effect. Tone mapping, again, here you can go and change your exposure if you feel like the lighting's not really doing it, and you can go and change sort of brightness and contrast and saturation, and you can do the same with color balance. Most of these tools are pretty self-explanatory, and if they're not, nothing stops you from just switching it on, testing it out, and switching it off again. Cool. So lighting, I mean, the textures and stuff, that's the same as what you've been doing. So the shaders are basically PBR based, and they use your metalness or specularity workflow, and you can plug in all your textures over here. So if you've those are all the materials on the object, which, as you can see, this model isn't very well prepared. It has a million textures, and it's really a pain to go and select each and every material and make sure that all the textures are applied to it. So that's why I was quite adamant that you guys reduce the amount of materials that you use on your model, because I know what a pain it is. Yeah, so there's subsurface scattering, normal maps, bump maps, and things like that. So on the helmet, I don't think there was anything. Helmet parts, or it didn't have those maps. The helmet itself had a bump map, a glossiness map, specular, and those kind of things. You'll just load them from your textures that you've uploaded along with your model. Some of the add-ons, like the Sketchfab add-on for Blender and Unity, I think sends the textures along with your model, uploads that, or uploads them both. But if they don't, you can also just add your textures and plug them in, see what happens. And it should ideally result in the same sort of render effects that you would see in Substance or Blender or Unity, because of the PBR workflow that sort of standardizes everything. All right, so these are the only ones that you really need to be concerned about. I think annotations are nice to have, so that you can sort of guide me through your model, and if you want to show off certain areas, please use annotations. But you don't really need animations on your models, and AR and VR is also unnecessary, so you don't need these features, nor do you need sound. So none of those are really essential. Again, maybe if you have time, or if you'd like to experiment, by all means, go ahead and do it. But I think at very least we need to do lighting, materials, and post-processing. And annotations are super cool to just guide the viewer. So I'm going to upgrade the Unity Asset Showcase project to 2019.4 long-term support, just because 2020 doesn't have an LTS yet. So if you have the 2019 LTS, this will work for you, and it should upgrade fairly seamlessly to 2020 though, because nothing has really changed in the render and the post-processing. But I'm going to make sure that at least it's compatible with the LTS version. I did say in the description of the assignment that you can do Sketchfab and or Unity build. You're welcome to give me both if you want to. I would definitely appreciate the effort, and I think anyone like I mentioned before, anyone that's a game major should really attempt a Unity build one. The project though would already be set up for you, and including the build settings, which this is not the right project, including the build settings. So all that you would need to do once you're don't worry, I'm not going to set it to Mac OS, but yeah, all you would need to do once you've imported your models and assigned all your materials is maybe tweak certain parts of the post-processing, perhaps change the lights up a bit, and after that you should be set. I mean, you're also welcome to switch out any of the environmental stuff. So you can play with this project, but essentially the way that it functions should remain intact, so that we can check what the wireframe looks like, and what it looks or what the triangle count is, and the object looks like in general. Transparency in Sketchfab, before I go to I think it's literally, no, that's just the color of it. Let me see, opacity. All right, so you have to switch opacity on, and then you can go and tweak the transparency of that. Sometimes you can plug a texture into that as well, and so if you want dust and scratches and stuff like that, you can have a black and white mask to affect that transparency. And in Unity, you would just tell the shader, I think I may have swapped out this shader already with a custom shader, so let me just grab something else that I didn't break already. Not the light probes, but yeah, look, those stands. So instead of opaque, just switch your lit shader to transparent, and then in the color value of that of your base color, you can go and tweak the alpha value. All right, so that you can see it's turning transparent. Now, one thing to keep in mind with transparency of sort of like anything really is that there's always a bending of light that is meant to happen when because we don't get these sort of ghostly shaders in real life. Normally it would be glass or water or something, and all of those objects have what we call an index of refraction, meaning the light that comes into the surface will bend within that surface and then exit at a different angle on the other side. That causes sort of an obscurity of sorts, so I mean the refraction will cause the whatever is behind it to be obscured or bent. And it will also cause some light rays that hit it to create sort of acoustics in real life. And again, those are things that we've sort of along the way tried to mimic and create tools for and shaders. But because it involves ray tracing, it actually involves calculating from which direction the lights came and where they're going. It's quite an expensive process. So shaders or game shaders or real-time shaders by default do not calculate index of refractions. And that's something that you may need to fake. So faking index of refraction, I think the actual process of doing it, I would have to go and think about for a bit. It may involve some sort of dual rendering process to do it correctly. But in principle, what I like about it is that it starts to let you think about why you would want to go and change the standard setup of the shaders, which brings us to custom shaders. So I did add a bit of that in the content or in the tutorials that I shared with you earlier. Like when to use specific shaders and when to maybe override your rendering passes and things like that. And it's one of those scenarios where it's not essential for you to create shaders, but if you have a particular need, like let's say refractions or editability, often it's kind of like a need for animated shaders or shaders that are quite unique, that like water shaders and stuff like that would need custom shading. In that other example that I had open, there were some custom shaders that I can show you as well that are sort of more robust than this standard PBR shader. What I did here, maybe just quickly check in if I actually did answer your question. Right. Okay, so transparency, I think we've sort of covered that. But let's say you want to make a shader. So a good example would be this one shader that I'm currently working on. I have a piano, and I want this piano to be able to play music based on sort of a texture input, so that I can play sort of any song in the background. Then I can visualize the audio wave with some sort of beat detection, and then I can convert that audio wave into the actual keys playing. So I already know what kind of texture I'm looking to produce, because these are the old, those old-timey Western pianos that you always see in the saloons that sort of play by themselves, even though the guy gets shot. And this is the sort of pattern that I'm meant to produce, but I need to now figure out a way that I'd be able to feed that pattern into the shader. So in that case, I think my key shader is still very early stages. It's basically just using the vertex colors at this point to make those keys black and white. But if you start adding things like procedural nodes, like, let's see what we have here, like normally noises and shapes. So for Vernoy, I think the shapes one maybe no, that's also standard. I just want to see, because recently what they did is release a update to their procedural shaders. So if you go to, I think it would be shader graph, let's give it a sec. So shader graph, there's a procedural patterns sort of a sample that you can, so shader graph comes standard with URP, you don't have to install it. separately. But if I import these procedural patterns, you'll see that the options that I have in terms of procedural textures are a little bit more robust. So now I can add stuff like zigzags and whatnot. Maybe there's one that makes dots, patterns, simple dots, sweet. And if I can somehow mask some of these dots and tell them to not appear in certain areas, let's just see if we can. Ooh, that's fun. Yeah, I think I'm going to be able to make a piano out of this eventually. Yeah, that's going to totally play my keys. Blum, 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 blum. Yeah, I'll see how I hook it up with the actual shader in the end, but maybe one that's a little bit more complete, and I may have shown you this before. Essentially what we have to start off with, right? So let's just take a step back quickly. If I go back to this project, so what I've done is, and maybe I'll just do that process again. Can delete this dude, and then this should turn pink because it was that material that was using that shader. So I just want to tell this material again that it should actually just use the standard lit shader that it used to. Okay, Universal Render Pipeline lit. Okay, so there it's in its original state, and yeah, this shader graph doesn't exist anymore, so I can close that window. And give it some time to refresh. Okay, so a standard lit shader, like if you've got URP installed already, then the standard shader gives you the option of switching between specular and metallic workflow, opaque or transparent textures, front facing or double-sided, alpha clipping, and receive shadows. And then it will have your shader inputs like your base color map, metallic, normal. These are pretty standard, and again they'll be present in the material settings for any real-time renderer really that uses a PBR workflow. So again, there's our metalness and specularity, albedo, color, specular, and roughness, glossy. So same features, different tools. If we now wanted to, let's say we have a need for this shader to do other things, like have a scrolling, like let's say like a tank track or something. Like if you made tank tracks, then it would be better, instead of trying to rig an entire system where little pieces that are intersecting shape around other wheels, that can be quite a different or difficult rig to make, if you know what I'm talking about. Tank tracks are quite complicated. Yeah, so instead of doing all these individual components, what you could do is you could have one solid piece of geometry with UVs that are correctly laid out, and you can actually have these tank tracks as a like a displacement map or something, a vertex displacement image perhaps, that could automatically just rotate, well, not even automatically, but could rotate based on the position of the other objects. So what's nice about the shader graph is that you have the ability to sort of custom and tell the shader what to do, and still maintain the same essential functionality as your standard shaders. So if you want something that kind of resembles your existing shaders, you can go and, let's say, create shader PBR graph. Okay, so this is my custom PBR shader, and if I open this, then you'll see that this standard shader now resembles the lit shader. So again, we have the surface options like metallic, opaque, front, back, all of that in here. So here we can say, here we can say metallic, opaque, transparent. So all of those options are over there, and all of those options are over there. So essentially, this graph is, this PBR graph is exactly the same shader as this, with the only difference being that I can now go and customize whatever happens before these things are being introduced into this PBR shader. So if I tell this material to use my custom shader, what you will notice though is it's just called custom. So everything turns gray because this shader itself doesn't have any of those values exposed. So the moment that you want to, or if I wanted to reconstruct that typical PBR workflow, I would need to go and create variables that I can affect in the shader itself in the editor. So I would most likely do texture 2D and do this base map, and then I'll do another texture 2D normal map, and etc, etc. So I'll continue to create these variables, and if I have these variables in my shader, and let's say the normal map is plugged into the normals, so there you go, normal into normal. Oh, I may need a converter for that, so let me just see, create node, normal, from texture. So normal from texture into there, and then from there into normal map, and then base map. I think I could just plug straight into, oh no, that also needs to be 2D texture, sample 2D texture. Yeah, so sample 2D texture, plug that into the albedo, and that base map then becomes the texture. And if I save this, you'll see that I can now go and plug in textures for my base map and my normal map. So other places where I've used this, was when I created the eye or the iris for this character, and I think I may have shown this to you before, but in any case, so this uses the standard PBR master shader. I'm only using albedo and normal, so only colors and normals. There's no specular because there's a lens over this, over that shader, so I didn't need to include any specularity in there. Or there, it does have a slight bit of specularity and smoothness, but those are just sort of fixed values, and I'm okay with that being there. I don't really need to tweak those, but I did expose the two colors so that someone that you know, if they want to apply it to a different character, you can go and change those colors out for other colors. And then I also exposed this value that I used called pupil size, that actually multiplies into the tiling of the noise patterns that I use. So here I just use different tiling and offsets, and I use the polar coordinates to get them to originate from the center and branch out from there. So it's kind of like a spherical unwrap. kind of like the mapping nodes that you'll find in Blender. And then just with a combination of blend nodes and masks and things, sort of came up with something that kind of resembles, like a toony version of the eye. And I thought, well, while I'm at it, may as well extract that same pattern and convert that into a normal map so that, when the light passes, it'll actually pick up and change the values on the edges and things, kind of like, like our irises do. So with those values exposed, I can in real time tweak the values of his eyes and change the size of his pupils. So I can animate this value if I wanted to. I can animate those values as well, but they're not really meant to be animated, they're just meant to be customized. So anything that you want to then tweak or use, in different instances of, you may want to just add to your blackboard so that those shaders become more valuable and more user-friendly. I think building shaders is kind of like a area of specialization in itself. You get shader artists that just do this on larger productions, and it's definitely something worth looking into if you enjoy texturing and you enjoy building procedural components. Then please do. But again, this is something like only on a once you need it basis. You don't need it for the outcomes of this assignment. You simply sort of need to know that it exists, so in case one day you find the need, or maybe you get frustrated with the standard shader and you're just like, well, this doesn't do what I wanted to do, I needed to do something else, then you know where to go to change that. Okay, unfortunately there's no API for you to go and build custom shaders in Sketchfab, but again, like I said, it's not really what it's meant for, and yeah, I don't know what the value of that would be really.